All right. So today we have Shreya Rajpal, CEO and co-founder of Guardrails AI, which you can find at guardrailsai.com. On the website, they describe themselves as mitigate Gen AI risks with guardrails, ship to prod with confidence and AI-powered validation. And then on GitHub, it's described as Guardrails is a Python framework that helps build reliable AI applications by performing a couple of functions, which we'll go into in the podcast. So with that long-winded introduction, welcome to the podcast, Shreya.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here and get really deep into talking about AI reliability and guardrails. Yeah.
So I guess to set the tone for the audience, without getting into the different types of guardrails or how they work, can you kind of give a brief definition of what guardrails are?
Oh yeah, I love that question because there's obviously the philosophical or rather conceptual interpretation of guardrails, and then there's also what guardrails means very technically around any AI application you're building. So I actually wouldn't go into the philosophical definition at all. It's like as the word kind of suggests. But one of the things that we did in our work really early on is like take this idea of like AI needs guardrails and thought very deeply about what this really meant and what we can learn from other high stakes complex AI applications and how they add like reliability and kind of manage their worst case AI risk. And so as part of that, like what some of the work I did was like develop or concretize this idea of an AI guardrail as being this explicit validation or verification check that occurs around any AI call or LLM call or foundation model API call that you make. So that on a very simple level, that's what a guardrail is in modern Gen AI frameworks, which is its explicit validation that happens on the input side or on the output side, and a bunch of them probably happening together. Yeah, that's kind of what a guardrail means. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, AI isn't new, right? Like, why do we need something like this now compared to with all of the previous generations of AI applications that we've seen? And I think it's really the kind of very different nature of what AI means today, which is, it's like this do everything, do anything model, right? That kind of has like unbounded answers, etc. And so you kind of need to explicitly verify that the assumptions that you're making from the model for your own use case kind of need, end up staying valid. And so that's kind of why guardrails today mean what they do for AI applications.
By the way, the company name is Guardrails, and the category name is Guardrails. So
Yeah.
it's as if you have a company named Big Data during the age of big data. This is a brilliant timing on your part, and brilliant naming and
Yeah.
grabbing of the domain on your part. So
And
uh,
this is one of those like Kleenex or Band-Aid, issues really. So I think the category name is called that because, we made this technology that then got, kind of became an industry standard and like standard practice in terms of how you build applications. So it's great for us, but it's also bad for us because, like the category name became it. But yeah, I think it's been really great to yeah, get that domain early on, like you said. Yeah.
So before we go into more the open source project, another stage setting question is, which is at this stage of generative AI, how would you assess the level of awareness? I guess awareness about guardrails,
Hmm.
for example, and yeah. So in particular, which industry sector or group of people are most likely to be using guardrails today? So forget about the future, but as of today, what's the level of awareness and who's the most engaged?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Um, in terms of industry maturity or awareness, I would say that so we're recording this in November of 2024. I would say right now, as of recording it, is the highest level of awareness that I've seen. When I so for example, like when I started the open source project before the company was even a thing, I would get a lot of questions that I'd be asked from people of like, is this evaluation? Is this monitoring? Is this like security? And I would say no, it's none of those things. It's kind of its own infrastructure piece. I think now cut to, like now, like almost a year and a half later, and I, talk to and work with guardrails teams internally at, like large organizations. So people have a lot more awareness of like what guardrails are, how they work, why they're needed, how they kind of like fit in the stack of, like building an entire application, like what their place is in the life cycle. The most, your second question was about like where I see the highest like pull in some sense. I think it's interesting because it tends to be pretty bimodal in terms of, like company, I would say like size or sophistication. On the one hand, we see like very early, sorry, we see very early stage, startups, companies, or like very Gen AI first, kind of like verticalized solutions that end up using guardrails. And, that tends to be because like these folks are, the earliest adopters. They're kind of like the cutting edge of what's being built with AI today. And so guardrails, because they're a new technology, a new paradigm, like they tend to be, early adopters of that. On the very other end, like these organizations where I'm talking about like internal guardrails teams, they tend to be like very large financial institutions that, have like have a lot to gain from successfully adopting and deploying Gen AI, but are also in, like regulated industries or have very high reputational risks, and, want to make sure that they do it very safely. So that bimodal adoption tends to be like what I see most. That said, like as the industry has matured, we really do see very cross-functional, like multi-stage adoption as well. But like historically, those bimodal kind of like peaks have been our highest pull. Yeah.
So it's interesting. So I was expecting kind of the regulated industries, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But the startups, there aren't they the move fast, break things kind of people?
They are. So it's nice that you bring that up because like my view on guardrails is not like you know um let's slow it down, let's make sure we're doing this, like in a way that doesn't
Yeah,
like
aren't you a party pooper?
I'm not actually. I am, so my background, for example, I worked in self-driving cars. I, really enjoy like very, very, I worked in AI like my whole
Yeah,
life, and I really enjoy doing very cool shit with AI,
yeah.
very cool things with AI. But because I've done that, I also understand that contrary to what people think, this isn't the party pooper, take. It's the how do we get these things like going? How do we get them, deployed and adopted without it being, like kind of like a mess of, it's unclear what the worst case risk is. It's unclear what the harm that's going to be causes, right? And counterintuitively, this actually tends to be like the big delay in, very mass, not, I wouldn't say adoption, but very mass deployment of like applications built using Gen AI today. And it's because like, the lack of reliability, the lack of like truly understanding what is my worst case harm or risk going to be means that people tend to be very hesitant about, like deploying it in any high stakes scenario, right? And all of like the Copilot like or like ChatGPT like applications are absolutely amazing. I use them every single day myself and I love them. But that can't be it, right? Like the purpose of Gen AI can't only be augmentation. Like the true value does come from when we, like kind of let it loose and let it do really high stakes decisions for us, right? And in order to do that, we need to kind of make sure we can have assurances on how it's going to like act, and that's kind of like what I see my job as. Yeah.
So you describe this as its own thing, right? So
Yeah.
it's not observability and monitoring. It's not
Yeah.
eval.
Yeah.
So basically, then the teams would have separate tools for those, is what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
And
Yeah.
so then they bring you in. So could you walk us through the architecture of the open source project and how it handles both input and output validation?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So um I think what we've done in the open source project, it's like a kind of like a 1-2 punch, where the first component of the open source project is, this orchestration framework. So it basically allows you to like put different guardrails together into what we call a guard. And a guard is very simply, like it's a collection of guardrails with like a bunch of cool infrastructure features built in. And this guard can be
So
run.
so when you say guardrails, I'm assuming so a guardrail might be guarding against bias. Another guardrail might be guarding against hallucination. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So a guardrail, exactly like you said, a guardrail is basically encapsulating one single, validity check. So if you think that like, if for your application, the lack of bias is essential for that output or input to be valid, then there'd be a bias guardrail. If the lack of hallucination is critical to it being a valid output, then like there'd be a hallucination guardrail.
Or PII is another.
Yeah, exactly. PII, jailbreaking is a very common one. In a regulated industry, like these like large banks, etc., one of the really essential ones ends up being financial advice. Like there's no, a very, very high risk associated with giving financial advice to any user question. And you want to make sure before an output passes through that there's no financial advice contained. So that would be the financial advice would be one specific guardrail. So how the open source is implemented, it's this idea of like you have all of these guardrails, and you want to like run them around an AI application, or every single time that you make a call to your favorite LLM. And how you end up doing that is that you create these guards, and the guards, they're collections of like input guardrails, they're collection of like output guardrails, and then you run them in line every single time. And so that's kind of what the open source framework does, which it basically provides you, all orchestration so that you can do this like inline calling very reliably with very low latency. We with like streaming support so that we stream validate everything that comes out of the LM. We provide like logging, etc. So that's the one component of the open source. The other big component,
And you do this, Shreya, just to clarify, you do this at the input layer and the output layer, right?
yeah, that's right. Yeah. Um, and the other big component of the open source is the Guardrails Hub. This is also, again, like this fully open source, repository that we created, and has guardrails that we've created, and the community, other large organizations, etc., have contributed to the hub. And it's basically like different guardrails for different types of use cases that catch different types of risks, etc. So how people typically end up using the open source is that they will pick and choose what guardrails off the hub they want, and they'll download them individually. And then typically for their own custom use cases, they'll also end up creating like a few custom guardrails, and they'll wrap up all of this big collection of guardrails into, input guards and output guards that they then run around their LLM application. And then we handle like all of the orchestration, etc., for them.
So this input and output guards, I guess, vary. So I love the idea of the hub,
Hmm.
but one downside of the hub, of course, is the signal to noise might degrade, right?
Yes, that's
So
right.
so you might have 20
Yeah.
guardrails against one thing, and then
Yeah.
now you're like in the Python ecosystem where I have
Mhm.
50 different libraries to extract data out of a PDF file, right?
Mhm.
So so how does a typical guard work
Mhm.
in terms of so if I have a prompt and I want to use one of these guards, so how do I download it, install it, and then
Mhm.
I guess if there's more than one guard for the thing I'm interested in, then do you provide tools to help me evaluate
Mhm.
which guard is better?
Yeah, that's a great question. So
Yeah.
I think both of those points are kind of tied together, which is, the signal to noise problem.
Yeah.
I think that's with any repository,
Community, ecosystem, and
any,
yeah.
yeah, exactly, any community, any ecosystem as it kind of starts growing. So I think it is a problem, but I think it's a fortunate position for us to kind of like be in that space. And then sorry, scam call. The other issue is that I'm just gonna sorry.
Yeah, do you provide tools for me to compare?
Yeah, I think that's a great. So yeah, I think that's a great question. So on the one hand, it's the discoverability issue, and then on the other hand, it is this issue around how do you understand which guardrail is right for you? How does it trade off in terms of like performance, which may be accuracy, F1 scores, whatever you might care about, or latency, or even the cost of like running this guardrail in line, right? So we're actually, depending on when the podcast comes out, we actually would be close to releasing a solution for this, or would have already released a solution for it. We're basically making the hub much more discoverable. so that you can like it basically enforces a taxonomy of like based on use cases, based on the popular kind of like risk frameworks that you might want to use, right? Which is typically how people find which guardrails they care about. They're like, I'm building a chatbot, what guardrails should I need? Or I'm building, like I want to be consistent with like OWASP top 10, which guardrails do I need, etc. And so you can find guardrails with that. And in terms of performance, the other big thing that we're doing there, again, depending on when the podcast comes out, this might already be implemented, is we're launching like benchmarks and leaderboards as part of the hub. And so we already do a lot of benchmarking on our own, backend, where we basically have our own like data sets that we've kind of curated for different tasks, like a data set for hallucination, a data set for PII, etc. And then all of the guardrails that are on the hub, we've kind of benchmarked them against this data set. So we're planning on releasing that publicly, as well as a harness to automatically kind of like run a lot of these benchmarks by itself. Yeah.
So years ago, I spent a lot of time hanging around Black Hat and DEF CON. So is there a man in the middle attack here where I create a guardrail, post it on your hub, it looks fine, and then boom.
Uh,
I hate to be the party pooper here, but
yeah.
yeah. You're not like Apple App Store where you like really do kind of
Yeah.
rigorous testing on these things. People just post them, right?
We people typically engage with us to post them. So even if you submit a guardrail, we'll typically connect with you in some way and then talk to you about it before it gets published on the hub. And the other part of this is that it's our belief in open source, right? So it's because every guardrail that's on the hub as well is also open source, so you can like go in and then examine the source code for any of these guardrails, and that adds a layer of like transparency, which up until now has been that we haven't seen any malicious actors. Yeah.
Up to now.
Up to now.
It's the key
That's
phrase
right.
there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I believe this is in the open source, but one of the key features is generating structured data from LLMs, right?
Not for Guardrails Hub. Guardrails open source allows you to generate, like query different LLMs, and it basically has prompt primitives that allow you to generate structured data in a very easy way. But like this was more a feature that was really needed when Guardrails first came out in March of last year. I think since then, there's been honestly really amazing work by all of the foundation model providers, organically to provide support for that. So I'd say that most people that use us now like don't really use the structured data feature anymore, and primarily use the hub and create these guards and then look at the logs that are generated and alert systems, etc.
Or use something like BAML, right? So BAML. Yeah,
Sorry.
BAML, the open source project, great for that kind of work.
Oh, I see. I don't think I'm familiar, but I can go check it out. Yeah.
So what are the most common integration patterns you're seeing among teams using guardrails?
Yeah. I would say that this is more now rather than like what we saw initially. So it also kind of like signals the trends that we're seeing in the industry. But like one of the most common patterns that we see is especially larger organizations now are at that point where they're building, like very centralized Gen AI infrastructure. And this infrastructure, typically will have, so for example, a model, like a model gateway that will allow, their internal users to auth in and like use a lot of different model providers with the same kind of like API, API patterns. It might have, like a model router, it might have a vector database, and then typically these centralized Gen AI infrastructure teams would want to add guardrails as another core component of their Gen AI platform. So that's the kind of like most common adoption pattern that we're seeing now in, like late 2024, where you have the centralized infrastructure and then different application teams or product teams within those organizations will use the centralized infrastructure to kind of like create guards for their like specific applications. When we started out, we saw a different like, integration pattern where it was much more kind of like application specific. And so also meant that it lived, within your application code. And then now that we've moved kind of to the centralized infrastructure pattern, this also means that how most people end up using guardrails is that they'll create like a Guardrails server. So it's basically kind of like a service that has a consistent API, like it's basically OpenAI API compatible. And you can like create your guards, run it on this service, and then instead of querying OpenAI directly, you query OpenAI through Guardrails server. And that means that it's one line of code change, but instead of getting like raw AI outputs, you end up getting these protected AI outputs. So that's kind of like like as the market has matured, like that's the integration pattern that we're seeing kind of like most commonly and most successfully.
So this is the standalone server mode. Is that what you're describing?
Yeah, that's right.
And so then, assuming I become successful and I start hitting that server hard,
Mhm.
have you guys tested in terms of scalability, latency?
Yeah. I think like we latency honestly is like one of our big, you know, I want to say like one of the things that people love most about us. We even the guardrails themselves, like we shoot for 50 to 100 millisecond latency, on each individual guardrail itself. And so, people will typically kind of see that. And then for the end to end, you're running multiple guards together, you'll still see, 100 to 150 millisecond latency or something for the end-to-end like
I mean,
validation.
at the end of the day, the LLMs are the main bottleneck anyway, right?
Yeah,
But
exactly.
but what you don't want to do is introduce another bottleneck. So by the way, Shreya, in terms of the individual guardrails, I imagine they ran the gamut, right? So some are rule-based, some use machine learning. Do some may even use small LLMs, in
Yeah,
which case they also have latency,
yeah. That's
right?
exactly right. Yeah,
So
yeah.
then, at some point, if you're a team using guardrails, one of you, as you decide, okay, I have 50 different choices to do
Mm,
guardrails against bias or PII,
mm.
then you'll have to kind of start doing some of these trade-offs, right? In terms
Yeah.
of,
I think those trade-offs are kind of already baked in, into the problem. Like anybody that's thinking of hallucination is thinking about like how important, like if I take a 5-second hit on latency, and I get like zero hallucinations, hypothetically, right?
Hmm.
Is that a worthwhile trade-off for me, or is it sufficient if I just, reduce the hallucinations that my application sees to, like under 10%, and then my only latency hit is, like 20 milliseconds, right? So those trade-offs are already there, primarily because, we live in the application layer, and then for any applications, there are all of these, like context around like which that application operates in. And this is also why the hub, with its many different guardrails for a single use case that use, different technologies, small fine-tuned models, maybe like similarity-based matching, etc., tends to be valuable because like people can pick and choose like where they lie on their trade-off, including like some people that don't really care about performance, but just want to be able to say like, okay, I added guardrails to my application, right? Just as a checkbox thing to maybe their stakeholders or something, and so they want like absolutely no latency, which we can also like provide based on the guardrail, what the guardrail is. I think, and we expect that like as we release the benchmarks and the leaderboards, this becomes much more, like our users are much more kind of like empowered to make that trade-off for themselves when they can look at like, okay, for the hallucination task, like there's these 10 guardrails, and then this is how they compare on, like, like maybe, area under curve, like ROC AUC, and like latency and cost. And then I can figure out as a user what's most important to me. Yeah.
I wonder, and this is might be science fiction at this point. I wonder at some point there will be a router for guardrails. So in other words, here's a prompt,
Mm,
here's 10 different guardrails I can use to guard against
mm,
for this prompt, but
mm,
based on this prompt, I will route it to
mm,
this one based on your kind of preference for cost, latency, whatever, right? So
mm.
correctness. At some point, I think one, if you have a hub where I can choose, why do I have to choose one?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
but that
absolutely.
this is not happening yet, I imagine.
Yeah. This is not happening yet. I think the
Yeah.
interesting thing is that like LM applications are also they're just systems at the end of the day, right? And then as those systems see a lot more, they're just much more deeply integrated into a lot of the applications that we interact with like day to day, I expect that we'll start to see like much more sophisticated patterns around like how to build very, very reliable applications come up. I think like as that happens, like what my goal and what the goal of the company is to make sure that like the invariables will remain consistent and that we are investing in the invariables. So this idea of, like having a community that actively thinks about like what are the common validations that I need to do for applications, and then collecting a lot of those validations in Hub, and then having a way to easily run them. Those are the things that will kind of always be invariant. And that, as the sophistication for these applications grow, we'd hope like continues to be like just more and more valuable. But I completely agree with
Yeah,
this idea.
because you can imagine, right? So if my prompt is easily doable by a
Yeah,
rule-based guardrail, I'll just go to the
yeah,
because that's fast. And then
yeah.
if my prompt is more complicated, I'll go to some kind of more LLM or ML-based
Yeah,
guardrail, right?
yeah. And we actually have some of this, like some of the guardrails are like ensembles or like cascades of, different types of ML models, right? And so we end up actually like I think we do this in our we have this one guardrail which is a competitor, like you can check for if there's any competitors to your product, mentioned, and it's a harder problem because they can be like, is it JPMC or JP Morgan, or like,
So
it's
entity resolution, basically, right?
but not
Yeah.
only that, right? Because entity resolution, and then you essentially have to kind of like I guess that's true, it is entity resolution, but you have to kind of like make sure that like you can do a quick pass by just matching on the name of the just like the hard coded names, and then kind of match. If you don't find any of those, then you end up going to kind of like the more sophisticated filter, etc. So even today, internally, we have some of those passes where like if you have high confidence in like some validation method, then you don't need to go into the more sophisticated methods. But this is more like on the internal guardrail level and not on the, okay, this query is not a very high cost or important query, and so why do we need to spend like more dollars, like, or more seconds like validating it. But yeah, as these systems grow, I expect that a lot of these like infrastructure patterns will get like more more just more complicated, basically. Yeah.
So if I give you a keynote at a conference and I give you 3 slides to brag about
Mm,
guardrails, particularly the open source guardrails,
mm,
in these 3 slides, you are allowed to give me
mm.
your 3 favorite use cases or case studies of Guardrails AI or Guardrails open source.
Mm.
What would they be?
Yeah, I think I think the biggest bragging rights, like on the open source outside of use cases, would first of all be that we really are the Kleenex of guardrails. We pioneered this thing which became a standard, which is really awesome to kind of see. Our work kind of have that level of impact. We are still the single largest, provider of guardrails, open source or otherwise, on the hub. As of recording, we have like 65 guardrails, and then we have like a lot more that are kind of coming on based on like partnerships that we have, etc. And then we also tend to have like the largest adoption anywhere, from our open source. Of the open source framework as well. In terms of use cases, you end up seeing chatbots first and foremost. I think almost everybody's doing chatbots, and that's also reflected in our use cases. So if you're building a chatbot, can you make sure that it doesn't hallucinate? Or can you catch hallucinations as they happen? Can you catch PII leakages as they happen? Can you detect like jailbreaking attempts as they happen, etc.? So that tends to be like one of the most well adopted use cases that we see. I think the other big use case that we're seeing is like more granular validation on agent workflows. So if I'm building an agent, can I make sure that I'm able to constrain different execution steps of my agent, within like what that step is kind of supposed to do? And this kind of goes back to the, what we were talking about earlier, which is that, it's the same underlying model that can kind of do everything under the sun. And in order to build like a very reliable, robust agent framework, you have to like severely constrain it to only do what it should do in that step, so that you can end up building this like, very complex, like graph-like system, right? So enforcing those limitations or constraints on LLM operation tends to be another big use case. And then interestingly, the final one that I kind of talk about, because we are like there's a number of like companies in the medical or healthcare domain that use us, is like summarization. So summarization tends to be a big use case in healthcare, like medical note summarization, etc. And because it's regulated and because it's healthcare, there's like very stringent requirements on what is and isn't okay to say. Like you can't abbreviate things, for example, right? And so making sure that like summaries are really factual and then contain all of the right verbiage tends to be another kind of like big use case for us.
So what usage of guardrails surprised you the most in terms of, oh wow, this is amazing.
Um, I would say that I actually have an answer for this because I was surprised, but other people I've talked to maybe weren't as surprised. So we can see who's downloading guardrails. Sorry, we can see which guardrails are getting downloaded most from the hub. So we have like telemetry around that. And then one of the very surprising things for me that probably one of the most popular guardrails that we have is around like toxicity. So like detecting toxic language, and then kind of like you can do all of these things with guardrails, like you block it, you rewrite it so that it doesn't contain that, etc. But just the fact that like toxic language and then maybe not hallucination, maybe not PII, that was kind of like surprising to me. But it continues to be one of our most popular guardrails on the hub, so that was surprising. Yeah.
And actually, to our listeners, I guess it's important to emphasize that while the foundation model and frontier model providers are trying to build some of these capabilities in, there's no way they can ever address your specific application and domain specific needs in terms of protecting you and your users from harmful results, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like it's this idea where, like hallucinations are really bad if you're a bank that's building a customer support chatbot, but they're actually really good if you're using an LLM for like creative writing or just like brainstorming purposes, right? So it's very hard to find this like global objective function of what good AI behavior looks like. And there's kind of no way around, like you can have things like, okay, don't tell a person like how to build a bomb, and it's okay to have like that level of like commonality, like for what the foundation model providers can do. But a lot of these things end up being like very very application specific. So you talked about harm. One of the other interpretations of one of the other ways that we see harm interpreted by people is that, is my product KPI violated, right? So does this this LLM response match what my company's communication policies, kind of like dictate? And then there's no way that an LLM or a foundation model can like bake that into their, into the guardrails that these models kind of come with by themselves. Yeah. So you'd always need like some level of like customization for your own organization, for your own use case, for your own domain, etc.
Until 2026, Shreya, when Elon announces the release of his artificial general ethical AI.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll keep
So
my eye on that.
let's see. So you're saying right now the people using guardrails, latency, while it's an issue, they're not that concerned about it. So if you were to assess uh, what's lacking in this domain in terms of what are people asking for? So I'm sure latency is there, but what else?
Customization is the big one. People want to kind of like figure out how they can customize it.
So
Uh,
the hub is not enough.
the hub isn't. I think like this is, I would say, more maybe like a UX problem
I
rather
see.
than like a technical capabilities problem, because we're open source, right? You can like literally go really deep in the code and just like add it however you need to. We provide very easy, classes that you can subclass or other ways to kind of like create your own guardrails, etc. But I think what people want to be able to do, especially for some of the model-based guardrails, are that, okay, you're using like some fine-tuned model internally for your guardrail, and then I want to, maybe like tweak it, etc., for my own data. And like that's maybe a customization problem that kind of people like seek out a bunch. Yeah.
Yeah, I think actually, and I just wrote about this. I think that the notion of these guardrails and guardrails tools should be integrated into what the Luminous guys are calling the AI alignment platform, where you have people of different personas, because the guardrails inherently right now seems like a very technical team focused initiative. But the reality is AI cuts across now different teams, right? So you got legal, compliance, product, and what they're building is a platform that will allow all these teams to collaborate, including the technical teams, can bring in their guardrail uh, tools. You should talk to them actually. I can introduce you.
Oh yeah,
Um,
absolutely. That would be great. Yeah.
so for teams who are just beginning to implement guardrails,
Mhm.
what's the best way to start? You don't want people to get overwhelmed, right?
Mhm. Yeah. I will say that like for teams that are just beginning to implement guardrails, first of all, you're not alone. Even with as much attention as like, responsible AI and then AI risk, etc., gets, like most organizations tend to be pretty like they are trying to understand like what best practices, etc., are. I will say that like our open source, because part of the fact because we're so early and like adopted more quickly, does tend to be like leaps and bounds ahead of like whatever else you kind of find. And so it is actually really geared towards how do you have a very easy kind of like quick start experience. So if you're kind of like trying to set up guardrails, what I will say is like try out our quick start experience and like setting up a guardrail server with any of the guardrails that you care about, and then just swap out like your OpenAI call or LLM call with like a call to the guard, and you'll kind of see that like, okay, functionally it ends up being like almost invisible unless there's a specific risk or harm that is being like actualized. And then try it out for like maybe PII or something very visible, right, and something very like tactical harm. And that's kind of like one of the easiest ways to get started and to kind of like think about like how this really fits into whatever AI work you're already doing. Yeah.
So the user experience is the same. The developer experience, I assume, is the same. OpenAI API, right? So
Yeah.
you'll probably make very minor code changes to your application, right?
Yeah. 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 That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so what about Shreya? The frontier and foundation models get updated every 6 months, right? So each provider updates their models every 6 months, although now it's so expensive. Maybe that becomes once a year, right? So,
Yeah.
um, do you does that impact you, or you don't care because basically you're outside of them anyway? They can get better, but you're kind of uh, outside of the model itself in some ways, right? So you just keep pushing forward, improving the guardrails in the hub can keep improving, uh, independent of any kind of new model. And by the way, right now, as I understand it, you're completely focused on text in, text out, right? So no multimodal, right?
Yeah, that's right. Text and text out only, because text is frankly just like a great internal interface, especially as you're building applications. In terms of like foundation model releases, I think like I'm a like a technologist at heart, so I'm personally like always very excited whenever new models come out, and I love like playing around with them. But from like a guardrails perspective, because it's a component of your infrastructure that is much more concerned with like your application behavior, right? So even as the models change, etc., you still have like certain expectations of what is valid, what is okay, what isn't okay out of your application that still will always remain. Whatever the models under the hood are kind of doing, and you always want to make sure that like, okay, even if like maybe the rate of hallucination goes down from like 20% to like 5% or something, like that 5% is still like essential for you to understand, right? One of my favorite kind of examples of this is that I think OpenAI had a release where they suddenly had a lot more refusals. And like colloquially, this was called as, okay, the models are suddenly like OpenAI's new release is very lazy. Like it'll just refuse to do anything you kind of like ask it to do. And people had applications that they were kind of building where suddenly the application just kind of stopped doing what it like just stop doing their own like customers like asks, and you need to kind of like just under, even if that's rare or something, it's just like good hygiene to understand when that's happening so that you can then kind of like start mitigating it and everything, right? So because like, and those application KPIs kind of will always be you'd always want to understand like how your application is doing in terms of those KPIs. Yeah.
And by the way, you're supposed to, in some ways, not care about their progress because you're kind of like outside and you're kind of an objective referee in some ways, right?
Yeah.
So if they get better, great. It's like I guess taking the sports analogy further, the game just gets more interesting, but it's still there'll still be errors, right?
Yeah. And the other kind of like cool thing about this space is that like progress isn't only on the frontier models getting better, right? It also means that like, people's understandings of like, okay, how do I do distillation or like how can I customize, maybe my other small model onto this like one specific task, etc. also parallelly keeps increasing, right? So I think it's going to like kind of like have this spread where like on one hand foundation frontier models keep getting better, but also like small models have like much more capabilities, etc. And so, keep like and so the model that you're using under the hood ends up being like pretty dynamic, but the application KPIs, the application like what's important to you for your application does continue to be like pretty constant throughout it all. Yeah.
By the way, to our listeners who might be thinking, well, I'm doing RAG or graph RAG, so I don't need this. But the reality is, RAG applications also hallucinate because they still rely on a large language model. And even if you pass information to the context window of the language model may still think, well, during training, I read about this topic, so I know better than what you're telling me, right?
Yeah, oh God, I do so much testing on these things, and then every time someone says, "I don't have hallucinations because we do," or "We've solved hallucinations because we do RAG," and I that's like I'm like, no, that is not the case. That is not how any of this works. And then even in our own internal testing, we just find that like RAG is just, I mean, RAG is essential. I talk to barely any people that aren't doing some form of RAG, but it's also so insufficient if you care about hallucinations, right?
Yeah.
And you see it like reflected in the numbers that we end up seeing. I also just recently built a course with the deep learning AI folks where the premise of the course is that you start from where you ended other courses of like, now I have a functional RAG chatbot on, like some internal documents. And now let's actually see that if you actually were to, like productionize and deploy this chatbot, what issues would you end up running into? And, like, so the course starts with like, take this chatbot and let's ask it some questions to see how it actually behaves, like when you deviate from, the very specific garden path that you like had in mind when you developed this, right? And you end up seeing like so many hallucinations, so many, like veering off topic kind of like risks, etc. And so the entire course is that let's take this RAG chatbot and let's now make it, like robust and make it so that it doesn't like hallucinate and it doesn't do any of these other things.
So let's take a concrete example. I have a single PDF file, right? So I do a very simple RAG application where I interrogate that PDF file, um, and then I obviously, I have a prompt. It extracts some information from that PDF file. Normally, I just pass that directly to the LLM, and then the LLM can still make shit up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how does the guardrail work in that context? So now the guardrail has access to the same search results, but then it just makes sure that whatever the LLM answers, hey, that's not backed up by what's in the search results. Is that what?
Yeah. Exactly. Like our approach to detecting hallucinations is very much, centered around this idea of like groundedness of
Yeah.
whatever the LLM says. And so what we end up doing is that we take an LLM response and then we try to like find sources on like a very granular level for like all of the LLM's responses. So that might end up looking like we split up any if the LM like spits out a bunch of like sentences or paragraphs, we like look at sentence by sentence citations, etc., if we can find them, or maybe like a couple of sentences grouped together on a very granular level, and we try to find like what references we can to validate like every claim that's made in that LM response. And if we can't find supporting evidence of that claim in the knowledge base that you trust or in the information that you have given us, then that is considered hallucinated. And we see this a lot where
And by the way, for the listeners, that's fast because that's basically just search at that point, right?
it's search, but it's also entailment, like natural language inference or entailment on top of search, because we end up like treating um, the searched kind of like references from your knowledge base as the premise, and then we treat the output that is generated by the LM as the hypothesis, and then we also like basically end up generating these like likelihood scores of like how likely is it that this kind of hypothesis is from this premise. So that is like the thing that adds latency, but once again we try to shoot for like 50 to 100 milliseconds. So we'll use like the models, and we'll only use the models, and then we'll like fine tune them or something until we can hit that latency. Yeah.
So you're not the way you work. It doesn't matter if my RAG application is scouring a million documents because you come after the fact, right? So
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
yeah. So obviously these models are becoming multimodal,
Hmm.
and I guess architecturally,
Hmm.
is there anything inherent text in, text out about the way you're designed?
Um, so I think the guardrails framework is pretty generalizable of, which is basically take this idea of what's valid or important to you, turn every single criteria, sorry, turn every single criteria into one guardrail, and then mix these guardrails up and then run them on the input or output side. I feel like that's a pretty generalizable construct. What's different about like multimodal LLMs is that like each guardrail, like the modality that it works on, and then how the guardrail even internally is implemented will change for like will look vastly different for images versus for text. But like I think there's a world in which, for example, we can detect like NSFW image content and something. So there'll be a guardrail that's NSFW image based or something that we can like create, and that kind of like runs within the same framework. I think right now we've kind of made a very conscious decision to focus only on text, and then primarily because like if you think about agents and like these other complex workflows, right? Text is like an amazing interface across like different steps of these agent workflows, and we expect that there's going to be like much more initial value or much more kind of like volume of like those types of use cases compared to like different modalities which will kind of live on like either end of like that application. So that's where our focus is. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you have to start somewhere, and
Yeah.
text in, text out is massive, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I guess the point is that looking ahead, if you do take on other modalities, the user and developer experience should not change that much, right?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
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 So what's next? 6 to 12 months, guardrails open source.
Yeah. I think, like I said, one of the things
Are we going to get this router?
not anytime soon,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah.
Yeah, but I think the two big things for Guardrails open source. I think one of the things I'm insanely excited about is the benchmarks and leaderboards that we're releasing. So, internally we already have a lot of those numbers, and we're trying to like figure out what's the best way to present this information so
So
that it's
this is purely on some kind of accuracy or ability to perform the task, not latency, right?
also latency.
Also latency. Okay.
Also latency, and also latency on different types of hardware. So like CPU latency, GPU latency, etc.
So do you care about cost?
We do, yeah.
So you should
Yeah.
tell me too, which one is the most expensive, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think not all So we can't do that for every single guardrail. We can only do it for the guardrails that are using LLMs under the hood, right?
Yeah,
Because that's
yeah,
very easy to
exactly.
like isolate the cost. But if you think about like, okay, there's some small fine-tuned model that you can deploy on CPU versus on GPU. I mean, you're getting different rates from your own kind of like, like a hyperscalers or something on the compute that you're getting, right? So it's very hard for us to say like, and then how many requests you're kind of fielding per second changes the cost of like one single validation. And so for those, it's much harder to kind of like talk about cost. So we do talk about latency and then the hardware you need to deploy it. Yeah. So that's one of the things I'm really excited about on the open source, which is this release of like benchmarks and leaderboards to make it very easy and transparent to understand like what you're kind of like which one to use and what expected performances are. The other big thing I'm really excited about is like a 1.0 guardrails release, which will we're still kind of like mapping that out. It won't come as early as the leaderboards will, but it'll be our stable API. So we're still on 0.x versions, and so we're still on like minor version releases. So our first major version with a very stable API is like what I'm really excited about.
So I'm looking at the Guardrails Hub. Are there any plans to organize, improve the
Yeah.
UX so that there's some sort of taxonomy?
Yeah, that's right. So there's already like some filters on the left that we added, around like risk filters and use case filters and stuff. But as you mentioned, like, organizing based on taxonomy, etc. It's part of the stuff that we're actively working on and then would be released around the same time as like the leaderboards.
So what's your position, Shreya, on a leaderboard? And this is kind of the problem here is it always rewards winners, right? So kind of like on Apple Podcasts, you can see the top podcasts, the most popular. So popularity leaderboard, but it reinforces the most popular and doesn't allow to discover new ones, right? So what's your take on popularity leaderboards?
Yeah, I think it's a good in a different life. I kind of worked on this problem a little bit in a different context where the same kind of content, you rely on like click-through rates and engagement numbers, and because you're ranking those higher, they just end up
Yeah.
stacking those engagement numbers. Um, Fortunately, at guardrails, our leaderboards are going to be like much more focused on like performance, etc., rather than like popularity, and that will be reflected in like how they're like organized as well. So so it'll be much more that like the best implementations, the most performant implementations will win more so than the ones that tend to be like most popular. Yeah.
But are you gonna expose popularity at some level? Kind of like GitHub stars, right? So
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
so are you gonna expose it to the user?
Yeah, I do think it's a valuable signal, right? Again,
Yeah.
because we're in this like really um like GenAI as a field is pretty new, and then or at least in its current like format, and then especially like enterprise adoption tends to be pretty new. So I think it is like pretty valuable for users to kind of think about like, oh, I want to build my application safely. What's the, how are other people doing this? Like, what is the most valuable thing that other people have? And like, I feel like the downloads or the popularity numbers are a good like, signal to help them do that. So I think we would expose that, but so I'm like a machine learning person in my background, and like if I was looking at this, like I think I would look at like, okay, what are other people using? But primarily what I'd look at is like, okay, what's the performance, what's the latency, is this something that I can like afford in terms of like latency, and then is this performance good enough where it'll manage my risk for me, and then based on that I'd make a decision on like, is this a guardrail I want to use or not. Yeah.
I wonder if there's some UX elements from Product Hub that you can steal, huh?
Possibly.
Yeah.
I think much more so after founding a company. Like I think when I used to do machine learning, I was just very focused on that. But
Yeah.
I think after founding a company, I think it's just really fun to think about like UX and the
Yeah.
different ways that people adopt, especially like new technology. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And with that, thank you, Shreya.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for inviting me, Ben.